It's hard to believe that we're already finished our study together of Philip Carr-Gomm's Druidcraft. But here we are. After all, the study never really ends. That's the great thing about a path like this is we've been given all of these wonderful springboards to jump forward into the future and to practice and to continue learning. But we're at the end, and ends are bittersweet things. So we asked you all to submit your questions and comments so that we could do a follow up at the very end. And we've collected them up, and you all asked some really good, deep questions and gave some really deep comments. And I just want to say right from the beginning that we probably won't have the time to go through everything, but we'll get through as many as we can. Let's talk about your questions today about Druidcraft as we walk together down creation's path. Hello, everyone. My name is Charlie. I am a Christo-Pagan Druid and priest of Bridget.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brian. I'm a Christo-Pagan Druid and sous chef to the Dagda.
Today, we are going to be going through your questions, comments, and just wrapping up our study of Druidcraft. It feels like it went too fast. It really feels like we just started, and here we are at the end of this book that feels ever so tiny. It feels so small, like it should be so much bigger. But I think one of its brilliant points is its brevity, that it's just enough to give you an introduction, to give you an idea, and to send you on your way to learn for yourself. And that is a lot of what Druidcraft is about. But before we get into all of it, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, follow, whatever the terminology happens to be on whatever app you're listening to us on. We do 5 original Christo-Pagan and Druid episodes Monday through Friday, and you don't want to miss a thing. We got a lot of cool stuff going up.
Yeah, this is really fun going through the book, doing this series. I know it left myself and Charlie very inspired and wanting to do other little series like this on covering other various topics. We already had a list of probably multiple years worth already piled up of ideas.
It's really hard to figure out where to go next, because there's part of me that kind of wants to go through Dion Fortune's Mystical Qabalah. There's part of me that wants to do Israel Regardie's 1-year manual, or Garden of Pomegranates for that matter. There's a bunch of different paths that we could take going forward. If there are any books that you would like us to do this kind of deep study into, let us know. There's also part of me that kind of wants to do a study through A.E. Waite's book on tarot, followed by Aleister Crowley's book on tarot, because there's a lot of thoughts about tarot out there, and these are the two poles of tarot reading. And I know a lot of people are really into tarot. I don't know. It's just some thoughts I'm putting out there into the universe. Let us know what you're interested in the comments. We always love to hear from you. And that's just scratching the surface of some of the things we've talked about.
Yeah, definitely let us know. We will take that into consideration and weigh it in our decision process on what next.
Yeah, given the times that we're currently living in, I kind of want to do a full study on Matthew Fox's latest book about the Antichrist.
Yeah, because that's definitely something heavily on a lot of people's minds now as they're going. Everything seems like end times.
Yeah, I really wanted to send the New Evangelical a copy of it when they were discussing the Antichrist on their podcast the other day. I was like, oh, have you read this book? Let's get into the questions.
So I guess I should start with the caveat. My apologies for name pronunciations. I am very bad at pronouncing words, names especially. It's so bad that when I started my work with the Dagda, he had a short argument with his daughter, Bridget, about whether or not I was supposed to start learning and practicing yoga. There were a lot of colorful analogies made about the preferences of various disgusting things experienced over having to hear me try to pronounce these words. It was decided that I should get an exemption because, I don't know, special, simple, you can fill in whatever adjective you feel is most appropriate. So I apologize up front because I'm about to try to pronounce some names, and yeah.
I still think you should study go with me, because then it would be our little secret language here in the heartland of the United States.
Okay, first question from Claudia 8186. And she had a question: can Latin Americans practice Druidism?
I answered this question in the comments over on YouTube when it was originally asked, but I thought this was a good question to ask for the podcast. Yes, Druidry is not tied to a specific ethnographic group. Don't let anybody lie to you that it was. The Celtic people did not seem to be a blood lineage group. And I say that because we do not find tight connections between the insular Celts, for example, and the Gaulish Celts in Europe. There's a big question as to whether it was more of a confederacy of different people groups that were bonded by a common language than a lineage or bloodline or anything like that. So I I think that if you are feeling the call to any of the Celtic paths, I think that is something that you should take seriously and interrogate within yourself if that's something you want to get into, because I'll warn you right now, especially with Irish paganism, if one of the two shows up, they will all eventually show up because they travel in groups. So it's not as simple as, well, Bridget seems interesting. Let's see what it's like to work with Bridget. Because if you start working with Bridget, Angus is going to show up, the Doug is going to show up, the Morgan's going to show up, Lou's going to show up, and on down the path you go. You end up having all of them in your life. Eventually, it is a bit of a commitment that way. Druidry in and of itself, I don't believe requires you to participate in any of the Celtic paths. And I know that might sound weird to people, but modern Druidry in its revived form, which that revival started about 3.5 centuries ago, was a poetic movement. It was a movement that was initially very Christian and Christo-pagan, and the pagan elements came into it a lot more later. William Blake was a member of the early Druid revival, and he, of course, practiced a form of Swedenborgianism, which, if you don't know what that is, it's a trip, and you can look into that if you want to. But it's about connecting to the spirit of inspiration, of Awen, of Imas, and learning to live that spirit of inspiration into the world. I don't think that you have to be of one particular people group, ethnicity, or culture to be able to connect to that spirit, to that energy. That's really the heart of all modern Druidry. Now, I think that you might get more out of it if you are on one of the Celtic paths. My preference, of course, is for the Irish tradition, but I also have very strong connections to the Welsh tradition as well, and can highly recommend it. But that's mainly because that is the tradition that was born out of these original stories, and so it allows you to root deeper into the tradition. But that's more about getting into the legends, the lore, and things like that. But I still bring my Christian faith with me. I still bring my Ozark folk magic with me. I think that it's okay to be a little bit more eclectic in Druidry. What little we know about the ancient Druids, the one thing that is constant in there is that they would be sent off to the islands, particularly to the island of Anglesey. That's what we call it now, where apparently the largest Druid academy was. Virtually all Druids trained through that institution there, went through their education there, at least in the earliest eras of Druidry. So in a way, that's where I'm like, it's a good thing to go back to those older stories, go back to those original stories to learn. But we don't see any major criteria other than aptitude and basically getting your letter of recommendation to go off to Anglesey to learn. In fact, men and women would go and learn, and we have ancient records of both male and female Druids. So it seems to have been a fairly open path, even historically. So yeah, I don't see a problem with that. Next question.
Okay. Next question. Can Druid and Witchcraft truly coexist, or are they separate paths?
There's some interesting things to think about here. One, since the revival, definitely, we've done a couple episodes now about the relationship between Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols. While I understand that a lot of, especially modern witches, want to separate themselves from Wicca, the witch revival that we are currently living in is so rooted in what Gerald Gardner did that it is virtually impossible to remove him from modern witchcraft. Now, he was one of of several strains that came forward, but if your practice has the 8 Sabbats in it, if your practice has the cup, the chalice, and the knife in it, if your practice is very rooted in the god and the goddess, then you are practicing a form of Wicca, whether you connect it to formal Wicca or not, because those were all elements that he put in there. If you have the Holly King and the Oak King, that comes from Gerald Gardner, not from earlier mythology. There are a lot of elements that have infused themselves into the modern witchcraft movement. They are very co-evolved, no matter what you think about modern witchcraft, and it has grown and developed over the years. But it all actually goes back really to the Golden Dawn revival in the 18. Many of the earliest proponents of witchcraft, with the exception of the Gospel of the Witches, which at some point we have to do an episode about the Gospel of the Witches, which is one of the other strains of early witchcraft revival. I think very few people even know about nowadays. It has survived, but I don't think it's anywhere near the mainstream of witchcraft. But with the exception of that path, most lines can be traced back to the Golden Dawn and the Golden Dawn system. That's either through the original Golden Dawn or through Aleister Crowley or through Dion Fortune, which Aleister Crowley and Dion Fortune were members of the Golden Dawn. So it all goes back to that initial seed that kind of started the Magick revival itself, the occult revival itself in earnest, especially in the English speaking world. So they are cousins, no matter how you want to look at it. And with the relationship between Gardner and Nichol, they're very much siblings. They grew up together. These two people were friends. In fact, the 8 Sabbats were originally put together by Ross Nichols and put into Wicca by Gerald Gardner. But that was one of Nichols' innovations in spirituality, was to have the 8 spokes of the year. They're intimately connected in their origins and in their revival. For the most part, I would say yes. The only exceptions to that is there are some folk witchcraft traditions that may or may not want to associate with anything else. There are some exclusivistic witchcraft traditions out there that kind of survived through the oppression of Christian Inquisition. There aren't that many of them, but there are some. I can think of one in Italy. I can think of some in Germany and others in Scandinavia. And of course, in the Spanish speaking world, there are actually quite a few that survived there. And one, they do and do not use the word witchcraft for themselves. So that's up to those practitioners to decide whether or not they even consider themselves witches or whatever the equivalent of witch would be in their language. And those may or may not feel a kinship with other pagan or spiritual paths. But for the most part, if somebody is calling themselves a witch, a lot of the witchy traditions that did survive, especially the ones that we're thinking about here in the West, were actually the ovate practices of Druidry that went underground and became healers in their local communities. This is where we get the rise of the cunning folk. This is where we get the cottage witches and those kinds of healing witches, that kind of folk magic that suffuses England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, as well as various parts of France and Spain. A lot of that is very interconnected with the ovate magic practices of the Druids. In a way, that witchcraft is Druidry pushed underground and getting named something else. Remember, when we say witch is a pejorative term that was created by the Inquisition in a crazy satanic panic that is really hard for us to understand, because we think of witches as they were going after folk practitioners. The witch craze, the anti-witch hysteria that hit Europe, was born out of this belief that there was an antithetical church that literally worshiped the devil, went out at night and literally danced with the devil, and had kind of a mirror clergy to the Catholic Church. And of course, as a mirror clergy, as patriarchal as the Catholic Church was, they were predominantly women and predominantly had women in positions of power. It really was a conspiracy theory that gave us the idea of the witch and would subsume groups like the Conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity during the Inquisition, and other groups as well. And so our modern word witch really comes from those places and the way that we've conceived of those things. So historically, we're talking about groups that probably had a druidic component to them in the first place that got pushed underground.
It's like the witch's broom and the flying
Yeah.
incense or the witches being able to fly, and a lot of that stuff was out of that, the satanic panic run ramp.
Yeah, the
Oh,
second great satanic panic, the witch cult of Europe. And if you want us to do some episodes on the witch cult of Europe, it's fascinating and dark. The podcast
it's
will get
dark.
very dark because there's a lot of
Yeah,
murder involved,
a lot of murder.
but a lot of murder.
One of the things I found really helpful when thinking about, is this practice and this practice truly separate? Could they coexist? Questions like that. I really like the family analogy and looking at it from that perspective. I find that really helpful because then you can really see, oh, a lot of these things are siblings, they're cousins, they may be nephews, nieces of other traditions. You can start to really see how they actually are connected. Like in any family relation, sometimes a family member could go down a less desired path, but it helps to prevent just going, this one is just purely evil and wrong. Like, it's rare that a family member will be just absolutely shunned for being completely wrong. It's much rare. And a lot of times you can see, though they may that crazy uncle a lot of us have rambling at the Thanksgiving dinner that you wish would have just stayed home. Yeah, he may have a lot of dumb ideas, but he's still family. He still has, at his core, there's still a lot of good things there. And it helps to buffer against some of those judgments, especially the snap judge, and it helps to buffer against the othering. It's much harder to other a group of practitioners when you're thinking of them as a sibling, even if they may have adopted some crazy ideas, they're still your sibling, and it's harder to other them
It's
versus
also
going, oh, this is just a demonic cult.
and just to wrap up this question, it's hard for us to remember how religion worked prior to the Catholic Church and the Inquisition, but there was a lot of free flow between spiritual paths. We find icons and statues of Brigid in Scandinavia, in Germany. We see her sacred items and images buried alongside Thor and Odin and Frigg in those areas. So Brigid was a presence in Nordic magic and worship and religion and worship. And we see a lot of Thor appearing in Wales and in Ireland. So we see this kind of cross pollination that was happening all the time between faiths, and it's a very different mode of acting than we had after the very inquisitorial Romanized imperial Christian church came in and started saying, no, everything is separate. Everything always has to be separate. Remember, synagogues used to be filled with what were called God-fearers. They were Gentiles that did not convert to Judaism, but showed up for Shabbat services anyway, because they were part and were treated as part of the community. There was a lot more overlap. And they also, by the way, probably went home and offered incense to the house gods and everything as well. So there was a lot of overlap in spiritual practice in the past that this phase of imperial Christianity really didn't and caused much more separation than we used to have.
This next question is a really interesting one. It's, how does Nwyfre connect us to the living world, and what happens when we lose that connection?
I like to compare Nwyfre to the Force. I think that's an easy handle for people to get onto. When you think of Obi-Wan's great description of the Force, it is all around us. It's created by all living things. It is in us and around us, flows through the entire universe. That is Nwyfre. Once you start connecting to it, you start to have a better sense of what is going on around you. And I think there are a lot of really good meditations for connecting into that. And I've been joking around with Brian that we might want to do a quote unquote Jedi training series that's
Yeah.
all about just connecting to Nwyfre, connecting to the living force, and how to actually foster that connection in and of in yourself. If that's something y'all would be interested in, please let us know in the comments. And of course, using the term Jedi would help get more people to see it. So that's why I would want to
So,
use that language.
and to give three real quick, more of the fantastical examples of this connection, because as a as a young practitioner, I really got into connecting into with Nwyfre and being very sensitive of that. The first one is you can become very sensitive and aware when a living creature or thing is in your presence. And your presence doesn't necessarily mean maybe a couple yards. You can actually extend your presence out to 100 yards, 50, 100 yards. Like you can actually extend it out to the point where while driving, I could sense the deer in the woods and their intentions, whether or not they were actually going to cross the road, and have avoided at least 4 specific accidents. One of them actually was 3 weeks ago where a herd of deer started to cross a road, and thankfully the 2 of them decided not to, and I was able to go in between, like, 6 different deer crossing the road and was able to connect into that and could sense their intentions and help encourage, like, the ones that already started, I could encourage them to finish crossing, and the other ones, I could encourage them to wait and allow myself to pass through because I was going fast enough that it would have been very difficult to try to maneuver around them. And that's one fantastic example. Another one is friends used to try to sneak up on me, and I would know before they even entered the room. And I could tell when they were approaching with that devious intent, even though it wasn't ill intent, it was still, they were trying to sneak up on me. And it would drive them crazy because they would, like, there used to be games like, can we sneak up on Brian? And I was like, I'd be like, oh, you might as well come in the room. I know you're just outside the doorway. And I'd be like, oh gosh. And the last one was I would be able to just show up. I could find specific people when looking for them because I could be that connected into the living force. I could connect in with that particular individual and be able to find them through that web. I know I've talked before about hunting with the huntsman and stuff and it, into that connectivity. And that's just some of it. And yeah,
It really does help you get a better sense of your surroundings, where things are, how things are going. And it really does connect you into all life. And like I said, we could really do a whole series on that. Now, I do think a lot of people, unfortunately, live detached from that.
yeah,
And I have to be very careful about how I say this because I am a person who has depression. So I am not saying that we would all have our clinical depression cured if we would just connect to Wi-Fi, because I don't believe that. But I think a lot of what people feel as that this kind of aching melancholy that they call depression, right? And I'm not talking about actual clinical depression here. I'm talking about that just that feeling untethered, that feeling lost, unmoored, that feeling alone, that sense of isolation that kind of
sometimes it,
permeate that sense of isolation that kind of permeates our society.
yeah,
I think a lot of,
it's sometimes, I would say it's sometimes experienced as a sensation of hunger that
yes.
food doesn't sate at all. It's actually a hunger for an aliveness.
Yeah, and I think a lot of addictions are born out of this. I know from my own experience that the less connected I let myself be, the more I want to drink, for example, the more when I think to my youth in the times that I had cut myself off from those experiences, I exhibited a lot of addictive behavior towards a lot of actions and behaviors that were not particularly healthy for me. And I'm not saying again that everything comes down to that, but when you are robbing yourself of a basic experience of life, it's like when you hold your breath and you feel that burning, that just aching, that desire to breathe, that's just all consuming, and you feel like you're going to get squashed out if you don't let yourself breathe. I think we feel a version of that when we intentionally disconnect ourselves from our conscious experience of Nwyfre. And while again, it would not solve all of our societal ills, I think it would help with a lot of them if we allowed ourselves to live in this sense of interconnectedness. As Thich Nhat Hanh called it, interbeing. I think there are a lot of ways to talk about Nwyfre. I don't think that Druidry has the monopoly on how to talk about it. I think a lot of what Thich Nhat Hanh said when he talked about interbeing is this similar concept of Nwyfre, especially when you read his books like The Energy of Prayer. You really see, I it's one of the books I actually recommend to people when they want to get more involved in Nwyfre, even though that word never appears in that book. He is talking about Nwyfre in that book
Very much
and
so.
does a really good job explaining the ideas of how to actually use and connect to it. Also, Power of Prayer, Han does the same thing. So Yeah, I think that it gives us this sense of unease that just permeates everything in our lives. And it's one of the reasons why I think we need to be doing what we can to help people reconnect to that basic aliveness that we are all a part of.
Another thing I see that happens in individuals when they lose that connection or cut themselves off is generally a rising, ever growing amount of anger and resentment, especially resentment towards those that are connected in. It's almost like a jealousy, but it's like on an unconscious level. Generally, the individual isn't aware that anger is generally a jealousy for people who are connected in. And there's a lot of not all angry old people, but sometimes, like in an angry old person, I'll see that where they've disconnected themselves from Nwyfre and the living world.
The last thing I want to say on this question is I think the biggest way that we punish ourselves and disconnect ourselves from New FRA is this belief that you can only experience it out in the forest on the nature hike or something like that. New FRA is everywhere. You could be in the heart of Manhattan and connect with New FRA because all of the people and plants and animals that are there are bringing New FRA into the city. You don't have, yes, it can be easier to go into a place that is just everything is alive, the trees, the ground, like life is
Yeah,
literally
it's abundant
surrounding
and
you.
in your face.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it can be easier to connect in a place like that. But I think that we willfully cut ourselves off from Nuefre when we are in a city or urban environment because we want to make this hard line between nature and human activity. And I don't think that is a justifiable way of thinking of things. Yes, humans can be very disruptive to nature and harmful and hurtful to nature, but Nuefre is everywhere. This connection is everywhere. And we need to be very clear in not separating ourselves from it because of our prejudice against certain types of environments. And I think we do that all too often.
Yeah. How do stories reinforce systems of control, and how can we reclaim them?
We talked about this actually a little bit the other day, but yeah, this is something I think we really need to be a part of and why I love teaching the Bardic arts and helping people to understand the Bardic arts because we are storytelling creatures. Don't let anybody mislead you into thinking we are logical, that we are anything other than creatures of story. You do not have a memory, you have a story that you have saved that you will rewrite every time you remember it. Memory is malleable. It is a story that you make better or worse every time you tread back over it. It's not something that is contained in crystal in your brain that always stays the same. And that's just the nature of who we are. We are story based creatures. The more we tell our stories, the more we participate in our stories, the more those stories will have influence over us. Now, this is something you start seeing when you start having it pointed out to you, the propaganda in a lot of shows, where no matter what, the police are always right. The police never do wrong. Even when you think the police did wrong, actually they did right. Maybe they did wrong, but it was for a good reason. So we're going to just let it slide that they did the bad thing. And you start seeing that they're getting you to, they're trying to convince you that you should accept the authority of these people over you, even when they are not behaving right. And when you start seeing these various ways that stories are reinforcing and convincing us that we should accept the power of others over us, then you start realizing how those stories have control over you. And so it's important to start looking at the underlying currents of each and every one of these stories that we listen to, love, and participate in so that we see what subtle manipulations are being imposed upon us. What little things are we being coerced to believe that we did not realize we were being coerced to believe? Is a lot of romance novels are subtly telling women that they should be submissive to men. And when you realize that, then you start realizing which types of romance novels you want to read or films that you want to participate in. There is a subtle coding in everything that may be telling you that certain ethnic groups or racial classes are inferior. And when you start seeing that, you realize the programming that's being put on you. And a lot of this just comes with wisdom, learning to see all the different ways we are being manipulated. And I'm not saying that as a bad word. Every time you have a conversation with someone, you are manipulating them because you are telling them a story that may or may not get woven into their story. Like manipulation is just communication. It's just some people use it as a dark art to get control over others. So when we talk about the various energies that we're participating in, I think the one that goes unseen the most is the energy of story and how these stories manipulate, control, and dominate us. And once you start seeing that, spells get broken. That's how you break the magic. You start seeing, oh, you were trying to control me in this way, that way, or the other way. No, I'm not going to let that happen anymore. And you break free. It's making sure that the stories that you're consuming are aligned with your values, aligned with the values that you want to have. If they're not, being very mindful to remind yourself when something bad happens, that's a bad thing. So that you're putting kind of a stopgap into your own brain to keep that aspect from getting put into your personal story. That answer the question?
Yeah. Yeah. Because it gives you your choice back
Y-
and be making active choice rather than reactive or passive, which in the end is one of the big things we're all looking for.
Yeah. Always be active. Don't be a reactor.
So that about wraps up our time here today for questions and answers. Thank you, everyone who submitted questions and answers. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of them. It was a whole mess of them. That was wonderful. I did want to give a special call out to Bay19 GLE and Mr. Brindle Style for a lot of their wonderful
I
questions
think
and
that's
comments.
pronounced Beagle.
I think it is pronounced Beagle. You can see my earlier comment on how bad I am at stuff. Thank you all very much for that. Continue the conversation.
I love seeing you all talking to each other actually in the chat and in the comment. It really makes me feel like we actually are moving towards the community that we're trying to build here. So thank you to everybody who participated in this. I hope you enjoyed this series. We're thinking about doing stuff like this more often. So if there is anything that you would like us to do this kind of a deep dive into, or any particular thing that you would like us to talk about, for example, I have seen A Course in Miracles coming back up again in conversations online. I am astounded by that. And so that it's an older book. It's something that we could do an episode on. We're definitely not going to go through everything that's in there because, well, once we do an episode on it, that will be clear. But I don't know if we're going to or not. I'm going to keep monitoring that. If it keeps popping up in conversations I'm seeing online, I feel like it's something that might need addressing. But if there's anything going on that you would like us to pay special attention to or speak directly to, or maybe even do a series on, let us know. We really love being and really want to be a community that fosters our mutual growth and development. All right, as we're heading out, let me know what you thought about this series, what you think about any of the potential series that we could do in the future. If you're watching us on YouTube or Spotify, you can leave a comment right there. If you're watching us anywhere else, even if it says you can leave a comment, they will not let us know. So leave a comment there anyway, because engagement is magic. And then head over to creationspaths.com, click on the chat, and you can leave a comment there, and we will see it and be able to get back to you. While you're there, if you happen to have a few dollars you can pass our way, we offer monthly and annual memberships. You can also support me on Patreon and Ko-fi. I am CE Dorset on both, or you can support us directly through Cash App at the hashtag Creations Paths. Thank you so much to everybody who does that. You really help us keep the lights on, keep food on our table, and a roof over our heads. If you don't have any money right now, or you're not sure we're the kind of people that you want to give your hard-earned treasure to, that's perfectly all right. But if we've ever done anything that's helped you out or you think would help others, please share it with them. That helps us out immensely. All right. And as we're heading out, we have to say a prayer to Bridget, mother of the three gods of wisdom, who lost their way and found their way into very unwise situations, but who showed us through their lives how to live our lives better. Help us and guide us in all that we do, that we may forge a better world for all to live in, that we may heal all of the pains that people suffer from, and that we might stand strong and call for justice wherever we need to stand. Amen.
Amen.